Hello, welcome to one more webinar. I'm Liane Henschke, Executive Director of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization that promotes global literacy and international awareness through the following programs: webinars, Global Dialogue, and Global Nashville with Claudine, Distinguished Speaker Series. It's our in-person events, normally luncheons. The school programs name Student Leaders Without Borders and Global Eats, where we go to different restaurants, we learn about the culture and the food and have fun. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Troy Stangaroni, who will talk about the geopolitical divergences on the Korean Peninsula. Troy will be hosted by Natalie Thibault, and this program is part of our webinar series, Global Dialogue. Please use the chat to ask questions to the speaker. Let me introduce the moderators of today's webinar. Natalie is an award-winning global leader with expertise in talent strategy and operational excellence. Most recently, she won Nashville's 40 Under 40 award with 16 months of relocating to the city from Europe and is nominated for Women Who Rock Nashville Community Activity Award. For nearly 17 years, Natalie delivered high-impact results in one of the most complex, matrixed, the fastest growing and innovative Fortune 10 tech companies in the world. As a lifelong learner, she is now pursuing her MBA at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Natalie values immersive international experiences to learn firsthand about politics, food, art, geography, global economics, etc. At 68 countries and counting, she believes it builds an almost instant connection when you can say, I know something about where you are from. But guess where she's traveling tomorrow with a cohort of 22 other MBA students? South Korea. Yeah. Natalie, I now turn it over to you to introduce Troy and moderate this discussion. Thank you both, as well as the participants of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henschke. Troy, welcome to our webinar today. Troy is the director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy and the deputy director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. Troy specializes in economic and foreign policy relations on the Korean Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific region. In addition to his work at the Wilson Center, he is a columnist for the Korea Times and a contributing author for The Diplomat. He is also a member of the steering committee for the North Korea Economic Forum at the George Washington Institute for Korean Studies, a member of the Korea America Student Conference's National Advisory Committee, and on the board of the International Council of Korean Studies. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Troy was a senior director and fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America, where he oversaw the Institute's programmatic initiatives and focused on issues pertaining to economic and foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula. During his time at KEI, he was also a 2012 to 2013 Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in South Korea, which is sponsored by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and he was also a visiting fellow at the East-West Center. Troy also previously worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Robert Torricelli on issues relating to foreign affairs and trade. He holds his master's in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a bachelor's in political science and economics from the University of Memphis. So thank you, Troy, for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
But before... Oh, sorry. I was going to say it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Before we get started and dive into South Korea, we always like to ask, to get to know our guests better, what is one fun fact about you that you think no one else in the room shares?
Well, I don't know about sharing. I mean, and I'm originally from Chattanooga. I went to the University of Memphis, so it's really great to be here for this and everything. But the fun fact. So I grew up a Cubs fan, and the reason being, WGN used to show Cubs games all the time, and in the summer, when you want to watch cartoons, the baseball game would be on, and so you end up watching the baseball game. But needless to say, I think a lot of people know that it took a while for the Cubs to go to the World Series. And so in 2016, when they finally did, I was looking to get tickets and to go to Wrigley. And needless to say, tickets were expensive. You had to buy them basically all on resale and everything. And I was debating, is it worth the money? And so a friend of mine who is a Mets fan, another team that hasn't necessarily had the most success, just kind of wrote back and was like, Troy, they may never go back to the World Series in your lifetime. Just pay the money, go and enjoy yourself. So I ended up buying a ticket, was at the first game at Wrigley in the World Series since 1945, Game 3. Needless to say, they did not win that game, but it was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's fantastic. Fantastic. So switching to Korea, what interested you about Korea's in the first place?
So growing up, when I was at the University of Memphis, and even when I was at LSE, I always thought that the European Union, the idea of pooling sovereignty, countries who had been at war with each other working together in such a close, tight way, was a really interesting thing, and was kind of what I thought I'd wanted to work on. But I'd also always been very interested in government, Congress, the Senate, its work on foreign affairs. And I was fortunate enough after graduating to be able to work for a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But the one thing that I kind of realized, actually working in the Senate rather than, being in school or something, is that at least in my lifetime, most of the major foreign policy issues were probably going to be focused on what we now call the Indo-Pacific, but then we would have said just Asia or East Asia. And so, really part of it was after I did my master's, just looking for an opportunity to work on the region. And, I think a lot of people who are typical that work on the region, where they had, this long time, love affair of Japan, or very interested in China because it was the largest country in the region. And in some ways, I think, Korea fits me well because, you come, Chattanooga is not the biggest town in, the region, or sorry, in Tennessee, but it's not the smallest either. There's a lot of competition, I think, people have between cities and things. And so there's part of me that I guess is always kind of like, you're kind of fighting a little bit the underdog and everything. And so Korea is kind of that. It's the country that's been successful. It's still divided, obviously, with North and South Korea. It's not the country that we maybe put the most focus on, but it's one that we probably should put more on, and that has kind of earned its place. So I think it's really fascinating. It kind of maybe fits my personality to agree as well.
Thank you. By the way, I visited Chattanooga this past fall, and it is a beautiful, beautiful city. So very beautiful.
If you could do foreign policy from there, I'd love to, just live there. And maybe someday, now that we have all this remote stuff, it'll work out that way. But for the moment, everybody still wants you, right here. So. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'll cross my fingers and send good vibes that it works out. Well, we've got 5 different topics today, but feel free to our participants to jump in at any time and answer questions. We thought you might be interested in the changing realities from Trump's term 1 to term 2, the ripple effects due to our global interconnectedness, key partnerships, the future, like what does the future look like, and best practices that we can learn from that region and or other regions for how we do business in South Korea. So we're going to jump in to the first set of questions, which is probably hot on everyone's mind, which is the changing realities from Trump term 1 to Trump term 2. So what's changed in the Indo-Pacific region since Trump's first term?
So, it's been a lot. If we think about this, there was the Biden administration between the first and second Trump term. So it wasn't like a normal presidency where you just have back-to-back terms. Mm-hmm. And so if we think about, the administration's relationship with the region the first time, clearly President Trump and Prime Minister Abe were close. And so now we're in a situation to where it's not just that simply Abe isn't in power, but he was tragically assassinated. So you have new leadership in Japan. You have new leadership, and we'll talk more about this in Korea. You also have political crisis in Korea, which in some ways that actually hasn't changed, because when President Trump first came to office, South Korea was going through another political crisis at the time and another impeachment. So maybe that hasn't really changed.
Right.
But, Australia has a new government. You have, a new prime minister in New Zealand. You have a new president in Indonesia. Two of the things that have sort of stayed the same are Prime Minister Modi is still leading in India, and Xi Jinping obviously is still, the president of China. And so like those two are maybe forms of stability, but from a political standpoint, a lot has changed. It's much different. If we look at this from an economic standpoint, it was actually in the last days of the Trump administration, the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, a major free trade agreement that excluded the United States, but that had China, the ASEAN countries, South Korea, and Japan, was signed. It was implemented during the Biden administration, but so you're seeing a shift in the economic gravity in the region. Countries are moving away from the United States and more towards intra-regional trade. If we just look at, it's really more over the last decade or so. So this would include part of Trump 1 and part of the Biden administration. You're seeing more investment by China in the region than the United States. You're seeing more foreign direct investment by China in the region than the United States. So the US is losing ground economically to China in the region. So, President Trump comes into a situation to where the United States is worse off than it was when he was first inaugurated during his first term. So you've seen a rapid shift in the economic dimension. And, if you just think about this from a security perspective, countries are increasingly weary of China, but at the same time, Russia is starting to play a role in the region. Russia's always been India's largest supplier of arms, but during the Ukraine war, we've seen Russia develop a deeper energy relationship with India. We've seen Russia try to take and start really focusing its trade more sort of down Central Asia into South Asia. So Russia is starting to play more of a role in the region than it maybe had since the days of the Soviet Union. So while it may not necessarily be a military dynamic, the dynamics in terms of geopolitics are starting to change more with Russia's involvement as well. So I think there's been a lot of change in the region, and in some ways that's not surprising, but it's a lot of change that's maybe adverse to US interests as well.
Right. Okay. So with all of these changes in the region, and for our participants, we thought we wanted to start macro and start big so that we could understand how the Koreas fit into this bigger, broader picture in the region. But with all of these changes in the region, how do we expect these changes to impact the U.S.'s foreign policies, whether that's political, economic, or otherwise in the region?
So I think a lot of this sort of depends on the direction the Trump administration takes with China. We have seen over the last month or so, the administration put in place 2 sets of 10% tariffs on goods from China. And there's a lot of questions about, what the objective is. And I don't think anybody can honestly say at this point. One thought is that this is about US competitiveness, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. There's a related thought that this could be about taking and reducing the trade deficit with China, but also basically creating leverage to get the Chinese to buy more US goods. So it's not really necessarily about moving manufacturing back here, though that'd be part of it, but more about just trying to rebalance the economic relationship. And I think everything else in the region will spring from that, because if we end up in more of a military confrontation to where the tariffs become more of a tool of containment rather than the tool of negotiating leverage, then that will take and shape the policy of the US towards both our allies in South Korea and Japan and others in the region, but also more broadly than how we approach the region as well. Is it more of a building out of containment of China, or is it more of, all right, we've now traded in these tariffs, we've tried to use them for leverage, we've cut a deal with China, and then it's more about building ties on a more positive economic agenda throughout the region. So I think a lot of this will depend on what course the administration ultimately takes. And You know, I was at a conference recently with someone who was the first Trump administration, and they kind of laid out three alternatives. And even they have said that like they don't know which way they'll actually end up going. But I think that's sort of where all of that will flow from.
Great. So it's kind of like they've got a plan, but they're going to have to also innovate as things happen in real time and be able to respond to those things to achieve their objectives.
And also, I think there are difference of views in the administration. I think there are people, you know, like Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who have a long history of being China hawks and probably would want to take a very tough approach to China. And then you have the more business-oriented people who may see a threat from China, but ultimately, you know, want to cut some kind of deal. And so it's kind of how those dynamics end up weighing out, because, you know, the administration, like any administration, isn't monolithic in its views.
So stay tuned, and we'll see how all this plays out. So as we're thinking about the region, and one thing that comes to mind is Russia and its relationship with North Korea, and how that could impact the U.S.'s relationship with South Korea, or even Europe or the rest of the world. Can you tell us a little bit about the Russia-North Korea relationship and how it's impacting U.S. foreign policy or even domestic policy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this in some ways is the biggest shift in the region. And, you know, I wanted to talk about sort of North Korea separately because the change in the relationship has been dramatic. You know, there's a lot of discussion about how long lasting this will be, and we can talk about that later as well. But if we look at what's happened over the last 18 months or so, North Korea has supplied Russia with artillery, with troops, with ballistic missiles, and with other military hardware. And I think you can make a strong case that the Ukrainian defense has been put in a bad position because of North Korea's support of Russia. And, you know, at the time that North Korea started providing Russia with artillery, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had said, you know, this will make a difference. But where we are today is that North Korea supplied Russia with an estimated 9 million artillery shells. Now, those aren't necessarily the same quality as those provided by the United States and its allies to Ukraine, but the total for the United States and all of its allies is only 7.25 million roughly. And so you're talking about a situation to where North Korea on its own has outsupplied the United States and its allies. And so this, I think, has been, if we look at the way this war has progressed, clearly drones have played an important role. So in this case, Iran has really helped Russia. But part of this war has been about basically grinding down territory and using artillery to keep troops pinned down. And Russia has had an advantage over the last year or so over the Ukrainians. And this advantage is largely because of North Korea. So North Korea has become a major player in this war. I think one that's a lot more important than a lot of people realize. At the same time, the question becomes, all right, so what is North Korea receiving in return from Russia?
Yes.
And one, there was a group that monitored UN sanctions on North Korea, the UN panel of experts. Russia vetoed the extension of its mandate, so it now no longer exists. So there's nobody to look at how Russia and North Korea are violating UN sanctions. And we should be clear, they are violating them together. The shipment of arms to Russia is a violation of UN sanctions in and of itself. But at the same time, we have good reason to believe that Russia is providing North Korea with fuel, which is also a violation of UN sanctions, at least beyond a certain point. They're providing grain, they're likely providing fertilizer, they're providing some other things, maybe perhaps some medicines. Now, the food and the medicine wouldn't violate UN sanctions, but the real part where this comes in, that's not only a violation of UN sanctions, but where we look at the geopolitics, the security situation, is military hardware. What has been publicly put out there is that Russia is providing basically air defense missiles to North Korea. Two, it's believed that when North Korea put its satellite in orbit about a year ago, that Russia helped them take and solve some of the telemetry issues that they had. Three, there is reasons to believe Russia is working with the North Koreans on submarines, a technology that the North Koreans hadn't perfected yet. And then the biggest concern is that the Russians will help the North Koreans with re-entry for their ballistic missiles. North Korea tends to test ballistic missiles by shooting straight up, but it hasn't demonstrated that those ballistic missiles, which are capable of reaching the United States, wouldn't basically burn up on re-entry. And so if the Russians take and provide them that technology, it would make the North Korean threat to the American mainland very, very real. And so all of this plays into a degrading of the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. It makes the United States less safe. And all of these are the kinds of things that they're working on together. And at the same time, they've also renewed their mutual defense treaty, which is part of the reason why North Korea provided troops to Russia in the Ukraine war. So this has been a significant shift. And on top of the fact that Russia is no longer enforcing sanctions, if you read some of what some of the former panel of experts have said about China, China also largely about 5 years ago stopped enforcing UN sanctions. So North Korea has broken out of the sanctions bin. They're proliferating their weapons to Russia. They're likely to proliferate to other countries. It's become a much deeper threat for the United States, for South Korea, and Japan as well.
Right. And then something else I'm sure that's on everyone's mind is this recent conversation between President Zelensky and the U.S. and the president of the U.S., and then how that impacts our relations in the Indo-Pacific region. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so, clearly there are tensions within the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. And, President Trump in his address last night sort of hinted that, maybe there's a way back on this, and we'll have to see how this all plays out over the next few days and week or so. But, all of our allies are, I think, looking at this closely. Does the U.S. and Ukraine sort of patch things up and, okay, maybe this is a dispute and you get past it and everything and all, or is there a break in the relationship? And I think if there's a break in the relationship, it starts raising questions amongst our allies who, we should be clear, are in a different situation. We're a treaty ally with South Korea, we're a treaty ally with Japan. These are different relationships, but it'll raise questions about, okay, what kind of support can we expect from the United States if North Korea attacks? If China were to attack Taiwan and the United States wanted us to defend, what if, or to help support, what if the Japanese mainland, for example, is attacked? How much will the U.S. do to protect the mainland as well as Taiwan? And so these are all the types of questions that I think, this dynamic in Ukraine starts to raise. And, hopefully we can find a way forward with Ukraine, and this is something we can all move beyond. But, it does start raising these questions, especially in the aftermath of the pullout of Afghanistan and, sort of longer concerns, I think, even within the region of, how long would the U.S. stay in the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, switching gears just a little bit to tariffs and more that economic piece of the puzzle. Can you share with us a little bit about different types of tariffs and their implications? And then next we'll talk about how the U.S. domestic policies will affect foreign relations and vice versa. But first, tell us a little bit about tariffs and their implications.
Yeah. So right now, the Trump administration is looking to try and rebalance the U.S. trade relationship. And in the case of Mexico and Canada, take and try and make progress on issues related to illegal immigration and fentanyl. But so what we've seen is 25% tariffs put on both Canada and Mexico. There has been, in basically the last maybe 12 hours or so, some discussion that maybe those tariffs would be altered, autos might be exempted, and some other things. But for the moment, let's assume that it's just 25% of tariff across the board. Nominally, one might say that doesn't impact Korea, this is Canada and Mexico. But the reality is that global supply chains are often interconnected. The Kia Sorento that's sold in the United States is made in Mexico. So if the tariffs don't exempt automobiles, all of those would fit the 25% tariff. Now, that doesn't mean that the price would necessarily go up 25%. Some of this will depend on, the cost, how much Hyundai decides it can absorb for the Sorento, how much it can't. So, cost increases might shift. But, even for a country like Korea, there's an implication from the Canada-Mexico tariffs. And it's same true for China. About half the Hyundais and Kias sold in the United States are built in the United States, but some of the parts come from China. And I'll just give an example. during the beginning of the pandemic, as countries started dealing with their supply chains and everything, one of the things that came out is that all of the steering wheels for Korean automobiles were made in China. I don't know if that's still the case, but I do know that if you look at US data on where parts come from, that some of the parts in, Hyundais and Kias are from China. And this makes total sense with the way global supply chains are developed. But so there would be a tariff potentially on any part that comes from China for a vehicle assembled in the United States. And now, obviously, let's just stick with the steering wheel example. Steering wheels aren't the most expensive part of a vehicle. Even if you're paying like a 50% tariff on that, it's not likely to change the price of the vehicle much, if anything. But there are these sort of implications on these tariffs that are designed to deal with non-trade issues. And so then you have the tariffs designed for trade. So one, you have this idea that the administration has put forward of reciprocal tariffs. And so what this would do is, in essence, it would look at a country and say, you charge 10% for this good to come into your country, but we only charge 2%, so we're going to raise our tariff to 10%. But beyond that, the administration is also going to look into things like non-tariff barriers. And so, let's say one of the issues we had in the past with Korea was the shape of the license plate. So that was just something you have to make differently. That costs money. So, those non-tariff barriers would be kind of factored in. And then the administration decided that they consider a value-added tax, which is what most countries use, is the equivalent to a tariff. And so you would put that in. So in the Korean case, there's been rough estimates floated that it might add like a 5% tariff on the US side for that. And then there's this question of currency, because, we've often talked about China and how it manages its currency and how it, deflates that, and that then takes and undercuts US competitiveness. So all of these things on the reciprocal tariff would be sort of combined together to come up with a new tariff to try and take and equalize the costs of doing business in the United States with the costs of doing business in those countries. So that's what that is. Then you have some tariffs that are going to deal with specific issues. The one from the first administration, which they've sort of revived and enhanced, deals with steel and aluminum. So there's a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. There used to be, from the first administration, Korea had negotiated an exemption. So Korea had agreed to limit the amount of steel it would send to the United States, but it wouldn't have to pay the tariff. The administration has ended that deal, and now all Korean steel faces a tariff. The good news for Korea, though, is that tariff aside, they can now ship whatever they want to the United States. So for them, in some ways, there's both good and bad, in this change. But so you have that for automobiles. There's discussion, or well, you will have that. It's not in place. I should be clear on that. There's discussion of one for semiconductors. There's discussion of one for pharmaceuticals, and then digital services taxes. So France, Canada, Korea was going to implement one. It's unclear now if they will. But basically, because a lot of tech companies don't pay taxes in their countries, and a lot of them, we should be clear, go to places like Ireland and put all their revenue there because it's taxed very low. They wanted to try and find a way to capture some of the taxes that you would normally get if this was like a physical good from these digital transactions. And so France, and like I said, some others have put these in place, but there's going to be likely a tariff on those countries as well to try and get them to change those policies. So you have some things that deal with specific policy issues, be they trade or not trade related. Some, like the steel, deal with the question of national security and whether we have enough steel production in a crisis in the United States. And then some of them deal with specific trade issues themselves and trying to take and encourage more manufacturing in the United States. And so that's sort of the gambit of where we are now and kind of like how they would each work and what they might mean.
Thank you. That's super fascinating how all of these seemingly unconnected things are truly very connected across the world. And I've got, I guess, a personal relationship with these things. One is my very first car was a Hyundai Elantra. I now have a Toyota Camry. So I'm invested in what happens in the region. And I worked at Amazon for almost 17 years. And so they certainly have operations around the world and this
Yeah.
digital piece that you just talked about, it will be interesting to see how that plays out for companies like Amazon and otherwise.
And I think, oh, sorry, I was gonna say, even if we go beyond cars, because I think, people are used to cars and everything.
Mhm.
So, I'm ethnically Italian and, I visited my relatives there and everything. And one of the things I had there years ago that wasn't sold in the United States was Nutella. But,
Okay.
global
Yeah.
trade and, low tariff barriers and everything have sort of helped introduce all of these types of products that just wouldn't have existed in the US market without. So, I think the hope is that, we can try to bring some of the manufacturing back to the US. We can try to take and build some more jobs out in these industries and everything, but that we can get back to a system to where we are exchanging all of these goods and ideas. Because there's a lot of things that, start in other countries that I think people enjoy in the United States, and maybe they don't realize that, it's from other countries, and that if everyone had kept the trade barriers we had, back before the Second World War, that, many of these things might not be available in the United States today.
Very interesting. So, kind of pulling on that thread just a little bit, in light of the deals and negotiations going on, are there certain deals that the U.S. would want to complete first that would then affect any deals that we make with the Koreas?
So I think Korea's in a challenging spot. As I mentioned sort of early on, they're in a political crisis right now. South Korean President Yoon Yeol had declared martial law on December 3rd. It was short-lived, but needless to say, there's now been an impeachment in South Korea. The way their impeachment works is the National Assembly votes to impeach, and then if there's enough votes, and in that case, it's 2/3, they then take and it goes to their constitutional court, and then the court has to determine whether this was a valid impeachment. There's been two prior impeachments. One was ruled invalid, one was ruled valid. I expect that sometime in the next maybe week or two, we'll know in South Korea whether this impeachment is ruled valid or not. If it's ruled valid, then South Korea will have 60 days for a presidential election, and roughly like mid-May, we'll have a new South Korean president. If it's ruled invalid, President Yoon will come back into office immediately. And so some of this from the Korean perspective is that, or sorry, excuse me, from the Trump administration perspective is at the moment, there's just not really anybody you can negotiate with in South Korea. There are obviously officials from the prior administration who are still in their jobs and everything, but you just don't know if these are people who, if they reach an agreement, that whoever is in power 2 months from now, basically, let's just say, will take and, abide by the agreement, would take and, accept it. And so I think there's just from the Korean perspective, a lot of uncertainty. Then beyond that, I think obviously because of the size of the relationship economically with China, with Canada, with Mexico, and even with the European Union, if we get this European Union, sorry, I forgot to mention, there might be a 25% just European Union tariff. Those are probably going to be first priorities just because of the size and the impact they have. South Korea is one of the world's largest economies, but just those are all, at least in terms of the United States and its overall relationship, the larger economy. So I would expect that unless, those governments decide to refrain for a period from, trying to reach an understanding with the Trump administration, that they would probably be the priorities going forward.
Great. So when we think about those key partnerships, and specifically with South Korea, are there instances of where we would want to decouple versus de-risk in that area, and vice versa?
So this is a fascinating question because, a lot of this debate started with China. And, first the question was like, okay, are we just going to decouple from China and, like end the relationship? And then the Europeans kind of introduced this idea of like, well, listen, there are problems with China, but we don't want to decouple because the economic relationship is too big and too important, but we do need to de-risk it. And so, in the context of the US and Korea, are there points to where maybe they would be interested in doing that with each other? And so, if we think about this in terms of decoupling, I don't think either country wants to decouple. So we're probably really focused on de-risking. And so if you look at this from a de-risking standpoint, one of the things that has been a concern, this is, the Biden administration, this is the Trump administration, this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue, is where the United States is positioned on semiconductors and what that means.
Okay.
Taiwan is a huge part of this in TSMC, but SK Hynix produces the high bandwidth memory, and that is what is used in NVIDIA's AI chips. And could you use lower quality memory? Yes, but then those chips wouldn't function as well. So in essence, you really need SK Hynix because Micron makes these, but SK Hynix is far and away the best. So you need this production. At the same time, you have Samsung, who is the world's largest producer of essentially other types of memory chips. And so you need that for all kinds of devices. If you have an iPhone and iPad, Apple tends to rotate between chips from Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, which is a US firm. So on the semiconductor side, there is a high dependence on South Korea. And so I think, we've seen an effort by the Biden administration to try and get Samsung and SK Hynix to invest more in the United States. I would expect you'll see that to continue under the Trump administration, and maybe specifically targeting SK Hynix, because where Samsung has one fab, they are building another fab in Texas, and they're also building a packaging facility. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize. When you have a fab, that's not the end of the story with the chip. It still needs to go to a packaging facility and then be laid out with other chips and everything into like one final piece. And so when Samsung's, packaging facility is done, then they'll be able to package some stuff here. And this is actually the United States, or one of the United States' weak points in the semiconductor supply chain, is there's not actually a lot of packaging facilities here. And so SK Hynix is building one, but they don't have a fab. So I could see the Trump administration really wanting SK Hynix to build a fabrication facility here for high bandwidth memory. TSMC is obviously building a cluster of facilities in Arizona. Something that would allow NVIDIA to produce chips here potentially. If you could have the SK Hynix here, then you could sort of finish out this product and build it in the United States. So I think de-risking in terms of bringing some of that production back to the United States is probably an area where the United States really wants to work with South Korea. If you look at this more broadly, I think South Korea's largest trading relationship in terms of dollar terms, not final products, because that becomes different, but is with China. Clearly it's something where they want to sort of reduce risk there, but a lot of what we've seen in recent years has been it's just shifting from China to the United States. So I think they probably want to take a de-risk from both China and the United States and be more dependent on other countries. So it's that way to avoid some of the political shifts that you can see on trade issues. And so in a broad sense, South Korea probably wants more diversification. But there are other areas to where, longer term cooperation could make sense. Some of the future technologies, it's like, EV batteries and these types of things. At some point, we're going to go back in this direction, just because if you believe that autonomous vehicles are the future, and I don't think anyone's going to stop trying to make autonomous vehicles, you need the types of batteries that are in EVs because you need an all-electric platform. And so if we're going to be a competitive auto industry, and if we want to make sure that the US auto industry is competitive globally, and that we're not ceding the autonomous vehicle segment to the Chinese, then we're going to need to go this way. And the primary battery producers are Korean firms and Panasonic from Japan. So I think there's going to be, I think, because of the politics of this, some interesting moments going forward. But I think you're going to see eventually a desire to work more closely with Korea to, one, reduce the risk of, basically being dependent on Chinese batteries for these kinds of things, but also then really working together to build out this industry and sort of take and try and, reduce some of the Chinese global market share. And then this, of course, gets into things like critical minerals, to where China dominates, and both countries, I think, probably want to de-risk from China on this. And this is one of the reasons why when you look at products like EV batteries, from a commercial standpoint, they help create a reason for there to be a market to develop new critical mineral supply chains. And then that helps to make those economically viable. So I think eventually we're going to get to this point to where there's going to be a lot of desire to work together, but maybe it's more to de-risk from China rather than potentially each other.
Got it. And I understand now that South Korea has this innovation hub modeled after things like Silicon Valley in the US, and other groups that do it really, really well. And so it sounds like they have a vested interest in accelerating innovation in these areas. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens over time, and to kind of think even longer term, beyond what you've already shared. What are additional things that the U.S. should prioritize right now to be able to maintain influence in the region 50 or 100 years from now?
So I mentioned some of this sort of up top, but one of the things that the administration is doing is they're doing their 90-day review of U.S. development assistance. Once that's complete, I think one of the components we need more development assistance in the Indo-Pacific. We could talk about whether we do that in a different way than we've done in the past, and that is all legitimate for any administration to discuss. But if we see China as the primary great power threat to the United States going forward, and if we see maintaining influence in the Indo-Pacific as a key part of any strategy, then we need to make sure that we are front and center and competing with China, and that if possible, we are out-competing China in the region. And so I think part of that component is going to be this development strategy. It also means we're going to need to work with US firms to take and invest more in the region. But at the same time, I think, clearly trade is a sensitive subject in the United States right now. I think we all understand that. And so, I don't think this is something to where, we could have a new free trade agreement with the Indo-Pacific to compete with RCEP or something. But what we can do is we can work with our partners, talk to the Koreans, talk to the Japanese, talk to the Australians, talk to India and say, listen, we know the challenges China presents, but we need you all to try and work together more to develop supply chains with each other, to trade more with each other, to try and really buffer the region against Chinese influence. And so some of this will be about policy coordination by getting everyone to work more with each other. Some of this will be about, like I said, we'll need to just simply invest more in the region. But ultimately, the economic component is going to be important. We've talked about, the need to rebuild the US Navy. There's discussions about maybe working with South Korea to do that because South Korea has a lot of ship capacity. But ultimately, all this flows from the economic side, because the more capacity there is in these countries in the region to take and grow their own defense spending because they have better economic growth, the better that is for the United States. The more they're able to trade with each other and reduce their dependence on China, the more that means that they can maintain the foreign policy independence. They don't have to worry about, the Chinese, like happened with South Korea over THAAD, being like, we would suggest you take and, withdraw that, and then, taking and basically, hurting Korea's auto industry, cutting potentially Korean firms out of their own battery market, cutting out tourism into South Korea, and a range of other things that China did to really kind of make their point to South Korea that they didn't like this foreign policy decision. And so if you want to avoid China trying to coerce countries, then you need to reduce countries' dependence on China. And so that means they need to all work more with each other, because it's something that's in all of their interests to take and reduce that dependence and to create a more balanced relationship with China in the long run. So it doesn't mean excluding China, but just having a more balanced relationship. And I think that's important too, because one of the things that, and this is kind of what drove the original Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum, is China takes and builds large capacity, more capacity than it needs, and then they export that at basically below cost prices, and then that undermines other countries' industries. And so you can sort of see, like, for example, now, in terms of the automobile industry, and specifically like EVs, China has twice the capacity of what you could sell in China. And that is greater than other countries and industries usually have when they become large exporting countries. So it's not just like this is normal for an exporting country kind of thing. Like China just has too much capacity. And the Chinese tend to not want to take and close down redundant factories. Understandable, nobody likes to lose jobs, But so their solution, rather than to take and, trim the industry, has been, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build an even bigger fleet of ships to export more vehicles. And so all that will do is reinforce the need for more capacity in China. And so, we really all need to work together on coordinated policies to take and sort of really send the signal to the Chinese that you can't just dump these goods and solve your economic problems by putting our workers out of, jobs, because you don't want to take and do the things you need to do to rebalance your own economy.
One of the things I learned in business is that no one is self-made, and your success is directly proportional to the strength of your network. And so it sounds like this is the case in global economics and politics as well.
Yeah.
To kind of end or to wrap up our conversation and then open it up before we open it up to the audience, let's end on best practices. So what are best practices for ways of working across the globe that we can apply to how we do business differently in South Korea, and vice versa? What can we take that what we're doing really well in that area and apply it to the way we work with other continents?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind just broadly is that, there are a lot of different cultures in the world and they handle things, differently. Japanese culture and Korean culture, while they share a lot of in common, are also very different. The Japanese tend to be, very reserved, more subtle. Koreans are very direct and very boisterous, So I think part of it is just kind of understanding who your counterpart is and what they might be receptive to. And some of that, let's be honest, takes time. It's just like even with an American friend of yours, who grew up in the same culture as you, we all react differently to things. But so part of this is just getting to know people. But, I think one of the things that's really been great about our relationship with Korea, and it had been very tense in like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, is that starting with the Bush administration, when we really worked to build out the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and Korea was making its own changes, it realized it needed to take and open its market up more. It needed to move more towards, modern Western standards if it really wanted to keep growing. And so there was kind of a mutual meeting of the minds, and we developed a working relationship to where we could work through problems and everything together. And so I think one of the things that I think is important about the Korea relationship, it's not to say it's perfect and no relationship is perfect, but is that we did develop a good rapport with South Korea by just kind of being frank with each other about what our concerns were, what we wanted to do. And so I think one of the lessons from Korea is like, when we have these challenges with other countries, sometimes you just need to be, honest with them and be like, this is an obstacle for us. This is what we need. And then try and see if there's a way to like work through it and everything. But I think, at the same time, I'm going to use a foreign policy example here rather than an economic one. But for a long, long time, we have said that Japan is the most important partner for us in Asia. It's, the cornerstone of our policy and everything. And I think when we start putting countries on levels, that starts creating problems. And, clearly, the Japanese like it. They like being the center of attention, that's all good. But part of the tensions we've seen between Korea and Japan tend to be reinforced by kind of signaling indirectly, if not intentionally, to Korea that it's less important than Japan. And, when the Second World War ended and Korea was recovering then from the Korean War just afterwards, clearly there were stark differences between what Korea and Japan could bring to the table. Now, depending on the issue, there's some issues to where Japan may be more important. In terms of helping the United States diplomatically in the region, I don't think anybody would say that there is a more important partner for the United States than Japan. But on a lot of these economic issues now, actually the center of gravity has moved to Korea. And on the military side, it probably has moved to Korea as well. And so I think maybe viewing our partners as partners who all bring some things to the table. Some areas, maybe they're not as strong a partner, some areas they're more. And rather than trying to sort of talk about who's special, who isn't, and all of this, we'd be more advisable to just sort of being like, we value our partners. And if we need to talk about specifics, say, we value working with Korea on X, we value working with Japan on Y. And I think that is, something I have kind of like learned working in the region is that, just like it's a sports team or a business, everybody brings unique skill sets to the table. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one person or team is better than the other. It's just that they have their unique characteristics, they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. And that, if you treat everybody more equally, you can take and, ultimately do more together because you can avoid some of the innate, rivalries that develop when we start taking and, putting people against each other or suggesting that some are better than others.
That's very interesting. That's a good, I think, life lesson just in general beyond foreign policy and how do you inspire change versus drive toxic competition that can actually erode change. So we're for all of our participants, I would encourage you to go to the Wilson Center website and watch Troy's videos and read his articles. They're exceptionally well done. I learned a lot in preparing for our discussion today, and would encourage you to take a look at those to learn even more beyond what we've discussed today. So, Dr. Henschke, we'll turn it back over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for this wonderful and very interesting conversation about the Korean Peninsula and what might lay ahead under the new U.S. administration. So many things to happen, and we will watch close what is going on. This webinar will be available on the Tennessee World Affairs Council.org soon. So I would also ask you to consider becoming a member and a donor supporting the Tennessee World Affairs Council to carry out its mission through all programs on global affairs. Thank you so much, Troy and Natalie, and thank you all for being here today, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, thanks. Have fun in Korea, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.